Avon, the serene town that became a haunting epicenter. Nestled amidst rolling hills and sprawling cornfields in the heart of Indiana, Avon was the kind of town where strangers waved as they passed you on Main Street. The population hovered just below 5,000. A community small enough where everyone seemed to know everyone's business, yet large enough for the occasional secret to stay hidden. Avon wasn't the type of place that made headlines, until it did. For decades, people came to Avon seeking solace from the chaos of nearby cities. It was a postcard-perfect community where time moved more slowly. You'd hear the crickets chirping at dusk while kids played under the glow of streetlights, their laughter echoing down quiet cul-de-sacs. Weekend farmers markets, hometown parades, and church potlucks painted the kind of idyllic life many outsiders could only dream of. Avon thrived on its reputation as a safe haven. Nothing major or alarming ever seemed to happen here, not until the summer of 2003. When the skeletons were unearthed in William Cooper's backyard after a freak rainstorm caused the ground to cave in, Avon's timeless veneer shattered. The very soil beneath the town, once thought to be untainted and sacred, yielded its dark and grotesque secrets. Residents, who once boasted of knowing their neighbors inside out, suddenly avoided eye contact. The idyllic stillness of the town became heavy with a thick atmosphere of fear and betrayal. Avon's story isn't just about what happened, it's about who it happened to. William Cooper wasn't a shadowy, reclusive figure living on the outskirts. No, William was Avon's metaphorical everyman. He picked up groceries at the corner store, attended town meetings, and even lent a helping hand at local events. His unassuming presence turned him into a trusted face in this close-knit community. But behind his placid exterior laid unimaginable darkness. In the days after the discovery, Main Street buzzed with whispers. The coffee shop on Fifth Avenue packed tighter than usual, not because people craved lattes but because everyone hungered for details. "How could this happen here?" they muttered to one another, shoving newspapers across tables and shaking their heads in disbelief. And him, William? No one could pair the grinning man in old photos with the monster the news described. For some, this revelation unleashed an unrelenting paranoia. How could a town so seemingly perfect harbor such horror for so long? Avon, after all, was the kind of community where you left your front doors unlocked, where neighbors didn't just borrow sugar, they knew your kids' favorite meals and could recite the milestones of your life. If William Cooper, a man whose backyard cookouts were the stuff of local legend, could mask a sinister secret, then who else in Avon was hiding something? As news vans rolled into Avon, cameras trailed every corner, and journalists painted the town as America's latest true crime obsession, longtime residents grew defensive. "This isn't who we are," one woman protested outside City Hall, clutching the hand of her bewildered granddaughter. But denial could only carry so far. Avon's facade of innocence had crumbled. Its manicured lawns and tidy front porches could no longer shield the town from the unsettling reality. Darkness can, in fact, reside anywhere, even in the heart of serenity. Avon wasn't just a place on a map anymore. It had become a story, a warning. Proof that evil doesn't always come dressed in black or skulk in locked basements. Sometimes it wears khakis and mows its lawn every Sunday at 10 a.m. Even years after the last headline faded, Avon's residents would look over their shoulders more often, their trust in each other irrevocably frayed. The town's signature charm, those sunset-lit sidewalks and cookies left on front steps, came to feel more like an illusion crafted by a collective naivety. In the calm before 2003, Avon thrived on its ability to keep the outside world at bay. By fall of that fateful year, however, it struggled under the weight of a question nobody wanted to voice aloud. How many other secrets had been buried in the soil, and how many would stay that way forever? The beginning of an accidental discovery. It all started with something as innocuous as a heavy summer rainstorm. The kind of rainstorm that you could see crawling in on the horizon from miles away, drenching everything in its path with relentless sheets of water. For 2 days straight, the skies over Avon had opened up, flooding streets and leaving the rich, dark Indiana soil heavy and saturated. On the third day, the storm passed, giving way to a damp, muggy heat that clung to the air like a wet blanket. Driveways were still slick with mud, and water pooled in low-lying areas of the fields that bordered the quiet town. In the backyard of an old house on Birch Lane, something unexpected happened. A portion of the ground behind a tilted, weather-beaten shed collapsed suddenly, as if the earth itself was exhaling a secret. It wasn't much at first, just a small sinkhole forming at the surface. But as the mud softened and eroded, the The hole grew wider, exposing what appeared to be a strangely out-of-place patch of old fabric jutting up from the earth. It was Jacob Hernandez, a landscaper hired to clear debris from the backyard, who first noticed it. "I thought it was maybe some sort of old tarp or a garbage bag," he would later tell investigators. It wasn't uncommon for older houses in Avon to have peculiar junk buried in odd places: an old tricycle, rusted cans, even forgotten tools. But as Jacob dug deeper, pulling at the edge of the fabric with gloved hands, the truth became impossible to ignore. Underneath what looked like a tattered shirt sleeve were fractured pieces of pale, dirt-stained bone. Jacob froze. At first he thought it could be from an animal, perhaps an old deer kill. He gingerly brushed away more of the soil, revealing a rounded shape that he quickly realized wasn't the skull of any animal he'd ever seen. His stomach twisted as the realization set in. This was human. He scrambled back, his heart thundering in his chest. "Call the cops!" he shouted over his shoulder at the homeowner, who had stepped out onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The confused homeowner, who'd only recently purchased the foreclosed property, looked startled, unsure of what Jacob was trying to say. When Jacob yelled again, louder this time, the meaning sunk in. The coffee cup slipped from the homeowner's fingers, shattering on the wooden steps. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Within the hour, the sleepy hum of Birch Lane was punctuated by flashing red and blue lights. Squad cars lined the narrow suburban street, and uniformed officers cordoned off the scene with bright yellow tape. Neighbors poked their heads out from behind curtains, whispering with their families as they craned to get a glance at what was happening. News like this, something so grim and out of place, stirred Avon's otherwise serene bubble. The small forensics team from the Avon County Sheriff's Department arrived next, bringing with them cameras, shovels, and evidence bags. It didn't take long for them to confirm what Jacob already suspected. The bones belonged to a human, likely buried there for quite some time. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested the remains initially dated back at least several years, depending on how deep they had been buried. But that wasn't all. The way the bones were tangled and compressed together made the discovery even more unsettling. It wasn't just one skeleton. As the team carefully excavated the site, more remains began to appear: rib bones, femur fragments, vertebrae. Every new find turned the calm suburban backyard into something straight out of a horror movie. Years' worth of soil, tightly compacted over what now appeared to be hastily buried bodies, had covered up the story their skeletal remains had to tell. What rattled the forensic investigators most was the state of the excavation site. The area was small, just a few paces wide, and it bore chilling signs that the bodies had been deposited there with deliberate haste. Once pristine garden soil had become a grim tapestry of human tragedy, woven together with decomposed clothing and scattered bone fragments. Shovels worked tirelessly as every inch of the sinkhole was analyzed and documented. For longtime Avon residents, this discovery was incomprehensible. Nothing like this had ever happened in their safe, postcard-perfect town. As the authorities worked late into the night under the glow of portable floodlights, the mumbles of nervous neighbors turned into full-blown speculation. Whose remains were these? How long had they been buried? And who was responsible? "But this is Avon," one woman whispered to her husband as she peered out the window across the street. "Things like this don't happen here." Her husband shook his head, unwilling to tear his eyes away from the frenzy of activity in the yard. "Apparently they do," he muttered darkly. The homeowner stood on the edge of the crime scene, pale-faced and wringing his hands. He answered the officer's questions as best as he could: how long he'd owned the house, just 6 months, whether he'd noticed anything unusual before, nothing except for some overgrowth he thought was harmless, and if he knew anything about the previous owner. It was this final question that caused the officers to exchange glances. The previous owner was William Cooper, a long-standing Avon resident who'd seemingly vanished without a trace about a week prior to the discovery. As one officer scribbled furiously in his notepad, another quietly remarked, "We're going to have some questions for Mr. Cooper, if we can find him." By the next morning, the peaceful facade of Avon was irrevocably fractured. National news stations caught wind of the story, and the press descended upon the town in droves. Helicopters hovered above the secluded streets, and reporters knocked on doors, frantically piecing together the lives of the town's residents. Questions loomed overhead like a storm cloud no one could escape from. Everything had begun with a simple sinkhole, but as Avon would soon learn, what lay beneath the ground was far more terrifying than anyone could have anticipated. William Cooper, the killer who walked among us. William Cooper was the kind of person who could fade into the background without ever drawing much attention. He wasn't exactly introverted, but he also didn't go out of his way to stand out. In a town like Avon, where most social interactions revolved around casual nods on the sidewalk or polite waves from your pickup truck, William fit in seamlessly. He was just Bill to his neighbors, a quiet, friendly guy who'd join in on a backyard barbecue or lend you his lawnmower without hesitating. At first glance, everything about William Cooper seemed reassuringly ordinary. He was in his early 40s, wore plain flannel shirts and jeans, and had a weathered face that made him look like someone who worked with his hands for a living, someone dependable, relatable, even trustworthy. His salt and pepper hair gave him an unexpectedly noble appearance, and his soft-spoken demeanor made people believe he was the kind of man who kept his head down, paid his dues, and worked hard just like everyone else. William made his living as a handyman, picking up odd jobs fixing fences, repairing roofs, and patching up drywall for families around Avon. His truck, a beat-up blue Chevy with a rusting tailgate, was a familiar sight in driveways across the town. Everyone seemed to have a story about Bill helping out in a pinch. "He fixed that leak under our sink for a third of the price the plumber wanted," one neighbor said. Others recalled seeing him shopping at the hardware store or hauling lumber from the local Home Depot, always greeting them with a quiet smile and a wave. No one thought twice about welcoming him into their homes. To his neighbors on Birch Lane, William was practically invisible, silent, but present. He didn't attend church regularly, but he'd shown up once or twice for special occasions like a Christmas service. People had noticed that he mostly kept to himself, especially after his wife's mysterious disappearance years earlier. Most assumed she'd simply left him, citing the frequent arguments they overheard late at night. "It's a shame," one neighbor muttered during a community potluck back then. "Poor guy, he seems so nice, but I guess not every marriage is meant to last." Avon being the kind of town where gossip burned hot but fizzled fast, nobody really pressed for details or offered to check in on him. The truth, however, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Unbeknownst to the friendly faces who saw him every day, William Cooper was living a double life. Behind the neatly trimmed hedges and the freshly painted shutters of his modest home, he was meticulously covering up a trail of unimaginable atrocities. The very lawn he dutifully mowed each Sunday morning concealed bones. The garden bed where neighbors once complimented the bright yellow tulips hid sinister secrets. While Avon residents were busy enjoying their peaceful lives, William had spent years committing heinous acts under their noses, confident that no one would ever suspect a man who lived so normally. For years, William had perfected the art of blending in. He was careful, methodical even, about how he presented himself to the world. He didn't drink excessively or gamble. He wasn't loud or confrontational. Instead, he played the long game, building a reputation for reliability that made others willing to overlook the peculiarities that occasionally slipped through. Most who knew him would say that he seemed a little distant, sure, but that was just Bill. "Some men are like that, it's harmless," they would say. But there were always subtle red flags, the kind that felt too small or vague to cause alarm. There was the time a couple down the street noticed strange smells wafting from the corner of his backyard. "Probably fertilizer," the wife had insisted when her husband commented on it. "You know he's always out there digging something." Then there were the frequent trips William made late at night, driving his truck to who knows where, headlights slicing through the darkened streets. A neighbor once asked if he was okay after seeing him pacing outside his house around midnight. "Just couldn't sleep," William had replied with one of those tight-lipped smiles that ended the conversation. If anyone had dared to look closer, they might have noticed how William avoided direct questions. They might have remembered how, despite his polite demeanor, he seemed to form no real friendships. He was a man of routines, superficial gestures and rehearsed small talk, a man who had perfected the act of being unremarkable. Perhaps the darkest aspect of William's story is that he used the very virtues of small-town life, trust, familiarity and neighborly kindness to cover his tracks. He chose his victims carefully, preying on those who were either isolated or too trusting. He invited them into his home under the guise of friendship or help, then betrayed them in ways too horrific to comprehend. His home, once seen as just another uninspiring house on Birch Lane, became a house of horrors. When the bones were discovered in his backyard, the shock rippled through the town like an earthquake. People frantically combed through their memories, trying to reconcile the friendly handyman they had known for years with the cold-blooded predator described in the news. "Not Bill," some neighbors exclaimed in disbelief, as reporters crowded the once quiet streets. There must be some mistake, but there was no mistake. The forensic evidence left no room for doubt. The smiling, soft-spoken man they had shared beers with at block parties was a monster hiding in plain sight. William Cooper didn't need a mask or a dark alley to perpetuate his crimes. He used the sunshine of suburban normalcy as his camouflage. For Avon, learning the truth about William was like waking up to find that their cherished Norman Rockwell painting had been defaced with something grotesque and unrecognizable. It wasn't just the fear of what he had done, it was the crushing realization that they hadn't seen it coming. He had lived among them, worked alongside them, and waved at their children on their way to school. And in doing so, he had shown just how thin the veneer of trust can be when evil knows how to play by the rules. Even after his arrest, the questions lingered. How had he gone unnoticed for so long? Was there someone else who suspected the truth but stayed silent? And most horrifying of all, could there be others like him still out there? Quiet, unassuming figures who knew how to keep their sins buried, both figuratively and literally. The victims, a string of forgotten disappearances. In a town as small as Avon, where everyone waved at each other in passing or borrowed sugar without hesitation, the disappearance of someone rarely went unnoticed. Yet, in the years leading up to 2003, 4 individuals faded from existence without leaving much of a ripple. Life moved on, explanations were assumed, and the community's collective memory quietly buried the mystery, until the truth clawed its way back to the surface. The first to vanish was Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher in the summer of 1998. Sarah had moved to Avon 3 years prior, seeking a slower pace of life after burning out in the demanding public school system of a larger city. Known for her kind demeanor and her love for gardening, Sarah quickly embedded herself into the Avon community. She attended church each Sunday, volunteered at the library, and even started a small neighborhood tutoring circle for struggling students. But then, one Monday in late July, Sarah didn't show up for her scheduled tutoring sessions. When her neighbor stopped by to check on her, Sarah's home was eerily quiet. The door wasn't locked and a cup of tea sat cold on the kitchen counter. Her car was still parked in the driveway. The police were called, but the search didn't yield much. A few neighbors speculated that she'd simply left, burnt out again perhaps, or maybe she'd met someone online and eloped. She was a private person, someone remarked dismissively at the time. Over time, her absence became yet another unsolved chapter in Avon's history, whispered about but never really explored. A year later, in 1999, James Harper, a 45-year-old truck driver, went missing on the outskirts of town. James was a man of habit. He always stopped at the same diner on the edge of Avon for coffee and a quick breakfast before hitting the road. The diner staff even knew his order by heart: black coffee, 2 scrambled eggs, and toast. The last time anyone saw him, he was heading into town to pick up supplies for a haul. A waitress remembered seeing him chatting briefly with William Cooper in the parking lot. He was laughing, she told police when questioned months later. Looked like they were making plans for something. When James didn't return home that night or the following night, his wife called the trucking company, only to learn that his last scheduled delivery had never been completed. His truck was eventually found abandoned on a back road several towns away, stripped of anything valuable. The authorities initially categorized it as a robbery gone wrong, another grim statistic in an otherwise quiet town. But for James's family, the robbery theory never sat right. "Jimmy wasn't careless," his younger brother insisted, his voice tight with frustration. But with no real evidence, his case went cold. Then came Marlene Diaz, a 58-year-old peddler who disappeared in the fall of 2000. Marlene was well known in Avon for her warmth and resourcefulness. She pushed an old wooden cart filled with everything from soap and candles to fresh-baked bread, weaving through neighborhoods with a bright smile and a knack for haggling. People often joked that Marlene knew everything about everyone in Avon. She was the town's unofficial historian, someone always ready to share a story or raise an eyebrow over a juicy piece of gossip. Her disappearance was a gut punch to the community, but not one that ignited consistent action. Marlene's life had been transient. She often stayed with distant relatives or camped in nearby fields while traveling from town to town. When she was last seen, she was speaking with William Cooper near the edge of a wooded area. A local farmer recalled seeing her cart abandoned not far from Cooper's house, its wheels stuck in the mud. Some speculated that she'd simply pulled up stakes and moved on, as she'd done before, while others whispered that something felt off. But with no immediate family to advocate for her and a lack of evidence, the police didn't investigate deeply. Marlene became another name added to Avon's growing list of unsolved disappearances. By the time Michelle Carter, a 25-year-old office assistant, disappeared in 2002, unease had begun to creep into Avon's once calm streets. Michelle had only lived in Avon for a year, having moved there after a rough breakup to start over. She worked at a small insurance office downtown, her desk always adorned with fresh flowers and motivational quotes. Michelle was the type of woman who brought cookies to work on Fridays and offered to babysit for her colleagues' kids. She embraced Avon's quiet charm with open arms, frequently posting idyllic photos of sunsets and cornfields to her social media. Her disappearance was sudden and jarring. A coworker noticed her chair empty on a Monday morning, her usual cheery texts having gone silent over the weekend. Concerned, they drove to her apartment, only to find the door locked and the lights off. Like Sarah before her, her car was still parked in its usual spot. A missing persons report was filed, but the investigation didn't move quickly. People were quick to jump to conclusions. Maybe she went back to her ex, one coworker speculated, though Michelle's friends vehemently denied this. She was simply gone, swallowed up by the quiet anonymity of small-town life. What linked all four disappearances? On the surface, almost nothing. They happened sporadically over several years to victims of varying ages, backgrounds, and routines. Avon's police department didn't have the resources to connect the dots, and the community, so steeped in the belief that Avon was safe, didn't push for answers. These were people who had once been part of Avon's fabric, their absence eventually replaced by new faces, new stories, and new routines. But there was one common thread: William Cooper. He had interacted with every single one of them in the weeks leading up to their disappearances. A casual conversation here, an offer to help fix a leaky faucet there. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But William had been that friendly, unassuming figure, always nearby when someone vanished. Looking back, neighbors would later lament their own blindness. "We all said the same thing," one resident would admit to reporters. "It's not like this is the kind of town where people just disappear." But they did, and we let it happen. The victims weren't just names on a police report, they were people with families, dreams, and stories left unfinished, and yet for years, their disappearances were treated as isolated incidents, swept under the rug as life continued its picturesque march through Avon. It wasn't until their remains were unearthed from William Cooper's backyard that their voices collectively screamed to be heard once more. The killer's method: exploiting trust and isolation. In small-town America, trust runs as deep as the roots of the old oak trees lining the streets. It's not just a courtesy, it's a currency. You trust your neighbor to water your plants when you go away for the weekend. You trust the kid running down the sidewalk to safely return the basketball to your driveway, and you trust the man who shows up with a toolbox and a kind smile, offering to fix the leaking sink or patch the hole in the roof. William Cooper knew this trust, and he manipulated it with deadly precision. The terrifying truth about William's method was just how simple it was. He didn't wear a mask or slither through the shadows of night. He didn't threaten, intimidate, or even openly harm his intended victims, at least, not at first. Instead, he used kindness as bait, weaving himself into the lives of his targets so effortlessly that they never saw the danger lurking behind his genial facade. William was a master of reading people. He recognized vulnerabilities in his neighbors the way some people read maps. He knew who felt alone, who was overworked, who had just moved to town and didn't know anyone they could truly call a friend. He didn't choose his victims at random. They were curated with care, handpicked because they had one thing in common: they were isolated, in one way or another. Take Sarah Thompson, the teacher who vanished, in 1998. During the weeks leading up to her disappearance, William had become something of a fixture in her life. He'd run into her at the grocery store, always at the same time she picked up her weekly haul of food, and strike up friendly small talk. "Teachers work harder than anyone else," he would say with an easy smile that masked his darker intentions. When her car wouldn't start one morning outside her home, William just happened to drive by. He offered to take a look under the hood, charming her with his knowledge of engines and his assurance that helping a neighbor was just what you did in a town like Avon. She invited him in for coffee to say thank you, thinking nothing of it. Then there was Michelle Carter, the 25-year-old office assistant who moved to Avon to start fresh. On her second day in town, she locked herself out of her car outside her apartment. The maintenance staff wasn't nearby to help, but William was, passing by in his trusty old truck, as if on cue. "Hey there," he said, tipping his cap as he assessed the situation. "Looks like I might have what you need in the back of my truck." In just a few minutes he popped the lock, leaving Michelle grateful enough to accept his phone number when he wrote it down, just in case she needed a hand in the future. She had no reason to doubt his intentions, not in Avon, where strangers still opened doors for one another and waved from their porches. This was the insidious brilliance of his method. He didn't rush or corner his victims. He planted himself in their lives like a slow-growing weed, remaining almost invisible until the moment he decided to strike. His unassuming demeanor, a man more prone to talk about fixing gutters than airing any personal drama, disarmed everyone. He was just Bill, the handyman with the rusty blue Chevy who always seemed ready to help. When it came time to act, William leveraged the trust he'd built to lure his victims to his home, a seemingly ordinary one-story house with a welcoming porch and neatly trimmed hedges. Few hesitated when he invited them over for some trivial reason. "I've got an old shovel you can borrow," or "Let me show you how to fix that kitchen cabinet we talked about." The house itself was as deceptive as the man who lived there. It embodied everything you'd expect from small-town America, cozy, unassuming, and safe on the surface. Once his victims crossed the threshold, however, their fate was sealed. Inside, William's charm would melt away, leaving behind the cold, calculated ruthlessness of a predator. Investigators later theorized that he relied heavily on the element of surprise, reducing the chance of resistance by catching his victims off guard. His home wasn't just a residence, it was his crime scene, his hunting ground. The basement, dimly lit and soundproofed with old sheets of insulation, became a chamber of horrors, hidden beneath an exterior of normalcy. Yet even as William carried out his atrocious acts, his methods were designed to ensure that he could continue blending seamlessly into the fabric of Avon. His victims were deliberately chosen not only for their isolation, but also for their perceived lack of close relationships, people whose eventual absence might raise questions but not alarm bells. A new resident like Michelle with distant family and few meaningful ties to the community was a perfect target. So was Sarah, who lived alone and had few connections outside of her students and colleagues. Marlene Diaz, the peddler, wandered from place to place so frequently that many assumed she'd simply taken off without saying goodbye. William even controlled the narrative after his crimes. If a neighbor asked about someone he knew was never coming back, he had a reply ready. "Sarah, oh yeah, she mentioned she was going to move closer to family. Smart decision, really." Or, for someone like Marlene, "Last I heard she said this wasn't her final stop. I figure she's on to the next town." His lies were delivered so naturally, so succinctly, that no one questioned them. But William's most dangerous weapon wasn't his lies or even his physical strength, it was the fact that no one wanted to believe someone they knew, someone they liked, could be capable of such evil. Avon was the kind of place where the possibility of a neighbor as a murderer seemed absurd, even laughable. That shield of collective denial allowed William to continue his monstrous behavior unchecked for years. For William, it wasn't just about the act of killing, it was about control. He controlled his victims by isolating them emotionally and physically, then betrayed their trust in the most heinous way imaginable. He controlled his community by carefully curating his image as just another neighbor, leaving no reason for suspicion to take root. When the truth finally came to light, Avon's residents didn't just grapple with the horror of his actions, they struggled with the betrayal. Knowing that their trust, the trust they'd so freely offered, had been turned into a weapon left a scar that would take generations to fade. Secrets uncovered from clues. The secrets William Cooper had so carefully buried, both in the ground and in his outward demeanor, began to unravel piece by piece, propelled by the discovery in his backyard. What started as a freak accident during a rainstorm turned into the trigger for a full-scale investigation that would uncover one of the most haunting crimes in Avon's history. Each clue investigators found only deepened the chilling mystery, leaving detectives and townsfolk reeling with the realization that they had missed the signs for years. The sequence of events began with the skeletons unearthed in the sinkhole, but it didn't end there. With police meticulously excavating the backyard, they uncovered more than just bones. Tangled in the soil were fragments of clothing, a faded cotton shirt, scrap fabric from a dress, pieces of shoelaces. For those who had lived in Avon during the years of the mysterious disappearances, the items bore unsettling familiarity. There was an immediate sense of recognition among some of the residents who whispered anxiously to one another, "That looks like Sarah's favorite cardigan," or, "I swear, Marlene wore that pattern all the time when she pushed her cart." The discoveries escalated when forensic teams swept through William Cooper's house. Every corner of the modest property was painstakingly searched. At first glance it looked just like any middle-class home in Avon, tidy, practical, with scuffed floors that told the story of a humble handyman's life. But behind the carefully curated normalcy lurked something far more sinister. In the bedroom closet, wedged behind stacks of old work boots and toolboxes, investigators found a carefully concealed compartment. Inside it were personal belongings belonging to the victims, items that had vanished along with them. A gold-plated bracelet engraved with Marlene, Sarah's wedding band inscribed with the date of her marriage, and Michelle's favorite leather purse she carried to work every day. Next to these was a weathered shoebox filled with curling photographs, snapshots of smiling faces taken without their knowledge. William had kept these trophies hidden, each representing lives he had cut short. But what sent a chill down the investigators' spines was the discovery of strands of hair tucked into tiny glass jars, one for each victim. They were labeled with innocuous dates, July 98, October 99, a practice that spoke to a meticulous mind obsessed with control. The jars weren't just trophies, they were evidence of how William's meticulous side had been corrupted into something dark and twisted, turning his acts of violence into moments to catalog and revisit. The basement of the home revealed more of William's secrets. The small, dimly lit space, half finished with peeling insulation along the walls, had been meticulously adapted to fit his grim purposes. There were faint scratch marks along the edge of a reinforced wooden table, marks forensic analysts determined came from at least 2 different people. Under the table were remnants of duct tape, fibers matching strands found on some of the clothing buried beneath his yard. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that made the already terrifying scene feel even more inhuman. Yet, for all the physical evidence William had left behind, some of the most telling clues came from the journals found stashed in an old work cabinet in the shed. Among the grease-streaked tools and half-empty cans of paint were several leather notebooks filled with William's handwritten entries. These weren't the casual musings of a lonely man, they were cryptic, fragmented records of his obsession. Described in shorthand, William recorded details about his victims, what they wore, how they smiled, the exact moments he knew he couldn't let them leave. There was no remorse in his words, only a chilling satisfaction, as if he saw his horrific actions as a form of art. "She trusted me. That's all it says about Sarah," one detective later recounted, shaking his head in disbelief. No emotion, no context, just those 3 words. But perhaps the most damning discovery came from an unlikely source, a loose floorboard in the living room. Beneath it was a storage space no one had expected. Inside were plastic storage bags filled with small objects, a set of keys with a rose-shaped keychain that had once belonged to Michelle, loose change and trinkets Marlene had likely carried in her cart, and a driver's license registered to James Harper. The discovery of James's license convinced investigators that they were finally beginning to understand the scope of the crime. Forensic technology played a key role in turning the found items into definitive pieces of evidence. Traces of Sarah's and Michelle's DNA were identified on fabric remains dug up from the backyard. The hair strands from the jars matched DNA samples taken from Sarah's family members, tying her to the scene years after she had been declared missing. Investigators used luminol to analyze stains in the basement, revealing traces of blood long scrubbed but never truly removed. It painted a horrifying picture of what had transpired within the walls William called home. As the evidence mounted, investigators began piecing together a timeline of William's crimes. Each clue strengthened the case, creating a narrative that tied him directly to the disappearances of Sarah, Marlene, James, and Michelle. But these weren't random crimes of opportunity. The more they delved into the case, the more it became clear that William had chosen his victims with purpose and deliberation. He had lured them into his home, exploiting their trust in the small-town promise of neighborly goodwill, manipulated their vulnerabilities until they felt safe around him, and then struck when their guard was down. With every piece of evidence painstakingly catalogued, the illusion William had adopted for years, the friendly handyman, the neighbor next door, crumbled into dust. Avon's police department built an airtight case against him, each shred of physical proof layered with the memories and testimonies of townsfolk now grappling with impossible guilt. "Maybe if I had checked in more," one neighbor admitted when interviewed by local reporters. "Maybe if someone had asked more questions, those people would still be alive." By the time the investigation concluded, not a single resident of Avon could claim ignorance. The damning evidence served as a grim reminder that behind the town's idyllic facade had lurked a nightmare hiding in plain sight. Every artifact, every journal entry, every fiber pulled together the complete picture of William Cooper, a man whose horrifying mastery of manipulation had allowed him to keep his victims' secrets, and his own, buried for far too long. The failures of the community and authorities. William Cooper's horrific crimes didn't unfold in a vacuum. For years he operated in broad daylight, hiding behind the mask of a mild-mannered handyman, while his backyard concealed the darkest truths Avon had ever known. As much as his cunning and careful methods enabled him to evade suspicion, there was another factor that allowed his spree to continue unchecked: the collective failures of both the community and the authorities that were supposed to protect it. No one set out to enable a killer, and yet through indifference, denial, and missed opportunities, William Cooper's web of lies went undiscovered for years. Small towns like Avon pride themselves on community and on trust. It's what ties neighbors together, what makes residents leave their doors unlocked and wave to passing cars without a second thought. But in Avon, that trust became its Achilles heel. When Sarah Thompson first disappeared back in 1998, the town's authorities and residents alike leaned on that trust as a way to dismiss real danger. Sarah just wanted a change of scenery, they reasoned. She probably left on her own. And when James Harper vanished only a year later, his disappearance was written off just as easily. Truck drivers have dangerous jobs, the police said. Maybe he ran into trouble out on the road. The truth was much harder to admit. Avon's residents didn't want to believe that something sinister could lurk in their idyllic town. When faced with the unthinkable, denial came easier than action. The same qualities that made Avon feel so safe, its familiarity, its tranquility, also made it terrifyingly easy to ignore signs of discord. "I mean, what could I have done about it?" one neighbor said during a later interview. He lived 3 doors down from William Cooper and remembered hearing odd noises a few times in the middle of the night. Rapid banging, a low hum, the occasional sound of something dragging. "At the time I just assumed, what, that he was fixing something in the basement, moving tools around. You don't think to report something like that. It's not like it seemed criminal." That kind of complacency wasn't confined to the people on Birch Lane. When Marlene Diaz went missing in 2000, the police didn't launch a wide-scale investigation. Marlene was an eccentric figure, often moving from one town to the next with her peddler's cart of handmade goods and baked treats. "That's just Marlene," people said. "She'll show up again in a few weeks." No one asked enough questions about why her cart had been mysteriously abandoned, or why the last place she'd been seen was near William Cooper's backyard. Her disappearance wasn't viewed as a warning sign, it was a passing tragedy that everyone assumed had a neat explanation. The resources of Avon's small-town law enforcement played a role as well. The local police department, accustomed to handling petty theft and the occasional car break-in, wasn't prepared for missing person cases, let alone serial crimes. "You've got to understand," said one retired officer from the Avon County Sheriff's Department. "This wasn't the kind of town where we expected to deal with something like this. Most of us were part-time. We didn't have homicide detectives or dedicated squads for missing persons. We were reacting, not investigating. It wasn't just a lack of experience, it was a lack of urgency." Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident. Because William was skilled at targeting victims who lived on the fringes of the community, newcomers like Michelle Carter or transient figures like Marlene, there wasn't enough pressure from families and friends to demand answers. And even when patterns began to emerge, no one connected the dots. After all, Avon was a town where bad things weren't supposed to happen. Why would anyone look for a killer in their midst when it was easier to write off tragedy as coincidence? For the community, there were also social barriers that prevented action. The veneer of small-town neighborliness made it difficult to confront uncomfortable truths. People might have whispered about strange smells coming from William Cooper's yard, or the way he seemed to keep odd hours at night, but no one wanted to pry. "You don't go accusing your neighbor of anything," one woman later remarked. "I mean, this is Avon, we trust each other, we mind our own business." That attitude let William operate in plain sight for years. No one watched too closely, no one asked too many questions, and no one wanted to be the one to cause a stir. Perhaps most haunting of all was the silent guilt shared among those who brushed shoulders with William but failed to act. "He fixed my garage door," one man said, shaking his head in disbelief after the news broke. "I shook that man's hand. He joked about the weather with me, and I thanked him. Could I have known? Should I have known?" A similar sentiment echoed in Avon's church pews, its grocery store aisles, its quiet cul-de-sacs. The community grappled with the possibility that they hadn't just failed to see the warning signs, they'd chosen not to. The authorities' mistakes were equally glaring. The police never pursued Sarah Thompson's case with the urgency it deserved, brushing her disappearance off as voluntary. When James Harper's abandoned truck was discovered just outside of Avon, law enforcement chalked it up to a robbery gone wrong without ever investigating William's connection to him. And when Marlene Diaz vanished, her transient lifestyle became the perfect excuse for inaction. Investigators didn't have the resources or the inclination to dig deeper, even when her cart was found abandoned near what would eventually be revealed as William Cooper's killing grounds. By the time Michelle Carter disappeared in 2002, Avon's residents were starting to feel the cracks in their once solid sense of safety. Yet even then, it wasn't enough to provoke a coordinated effort to uncover the truth. The community held fast to the idea that these tragedies were unrelated, unwilling to imagine that a predator could be lurking in their own backyard. It wasn't until the rainstorm of 2003 unearthed the skeletons in William Cooper's yard that the weight of all these failures became undeniable. The collective complacency of the community and the systemic oversights of law enforcement had created the perfect environment for William to carry out his atrocities unchecked. As the story made national headlines, Avon transformed from a symbol of peaceful, small-town America to a cautionary tale of how willful blindness and misplaced trust can allow evil to thrive. Even years later, the scars of those failures lingered. Avon's residents, once so proud of their close-knit community, found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. They set up memorials for the victims and added security cameras to their homes, but what haunted them more than anything was the question they couldn't shake. Could we have prevented this? The pursuit of William Cooper and his chilling confession. When the truth about William Cooper began to emerge, the serene streets of Avon erupted into a frenzy unlike anything the town had ever experienced. A quiet, unassuming handyman, a man whose presence barely registered on the radar of daily life, had been harboring the darkest of secrets. But just as investigators were piecing together the evidence to charge him, another shock rocked the community. William Cooper was gone. By the time law enforcement had enough to formally arrest William on suspicion of murder, he had vanished without a trace. News of the remains discovered in his backyard, in combination with the damning evidence unearthed in his home, had somehow reached Cooper before the police could close in. Whether through careful planning, sheer luck, or an informant, he had slipped away just hours before detectives arrived to serve a warrant. His truck, the beat-up blue Chevy that had been a constant sight in the driveways of the neighborhood, was gone as well. The announcement of his escape turned Avon's simmering fear into palpable panic. A man who had lived among them for years, who had looked them in the eye and shaken their hands, was now on the run, and nobody knew what he might do next. "If he could do what he did right under our noses," one neighbor said, her voice trembling for reporters, "then God help us all. There's no telling what he's capable of now." The FBI immediately joined the manhunt. Given the scale and horror of his crimes, William Cooper became a top priority on federal and state law enforcement's lists. Photos of his grizzled face and the plate number of his rusty blue truck were plastered across every news outlet in the country. For the first time since the Dust Bowl swept through their fields decades earlier, the tiny, unknown town of Avon found itself at the center of national headlines. Helicopter footage showed police cordoning off Cooper's property, investigators combing for any clues that might explain where he had gone. But William had been meticulous and calculating in his escape, leaving behind nothing but a growing sense of dread that followed his trail. The chase began in Avon but quickly expanded into a multi-state manhunt stretching across the Midwest. Police received scattered reports of sightings: a gas station attendant in Illinois who was certain she'd seen Cooper filling up a tank, a security camera in Ohio capturing a truck that might have been his pulling onto a rural back road. Each new lead pushed authorities further from Avon, sending them spiraling into endless miles of cornfields, winding highways, and anonymous motel parking lots. But no matter how thoroughly they tracked these tips, Cooper always seemed to stay one step ahead. "He knew the land better than most," said a retired parks officer who joined the search in Indiana. "He wasn't a city man. He was one of those people who could live off the grid and not bat an eye. It's terrifying, really. A man like that doesn't have a lot of needs." For weeks, the chase dragged on. Cooper's ability to disappear into rural sprawl only added to his infamy. Newspapers printed profiles on him, speculative psychology pieces that dissected his life with clinical fascination. TV news labeled him as the Midwest's most wanted, comparing him to infamous serial killers like John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy. But behind every headline, there was a community still reeling, still clutching their children a little closer at night, wondering if the man who had lived next door for so long might be lurking just outside their line of sight. The break in the case finally came on the 13th day of the pursuit, in a dusty town just inside the Kentucky border. Police were tipped off by a farmer who'd spotted a rusting blue Chevy abandoned near the edge of a sprawling cornfield, its interior hastily wiped clean but not clean enough. Inside, investigators found smudges of fingerprints matching Williams on the steering wheel and dashboard. They also found receipts from a hardware store dated just days earlier, suggesting he might have been camping close by. The trail led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a crumbling structure that once stored feed grain but had been left to rot for years. A passerby reported seeing a man fitting Cooper's description walking into the building at dusk, carrying what looked like a plastic bag of supplies. A tactical team was assembled to storm the building. The air outside was thick with tension, a cacophony of crickets mixing with the low hum of police radios. Officers surrounded the warehouse, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved in formation. The local sheriff's deep southern drawl cracked over the bullhorn. "William Cooper, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and no one gets hurt." There was nothing but silence and the distant creak of metal hinges swaying in the wind. Moments stretched into an eternity as the tactical team scanned every corner of the cavernous interior. Then, a sound, a rustling, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the far side of the warehouse. Cooper had been hiding in the shadows, his gaunt face slick with sweat and his hands trembling. When officers found him, he didn't resist. Instead, he simply sat down on the dusty floor, his eyes hollow, the faintest flicker of a bitter smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He muttered, almost inaudibly, as handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. It was never supposed to end this way. Back in custody, Williams' chilling confession would horrify investigators and the nation alike. In the stark interrogation room of a Kentucky police station, Cooper spilled his secrets in a voice void of emotion, reciting his crimes like reading from a grocery list. He admitted to targeting his victims deliberately, manipulating their trust, and luring them into his home. "I just wanted something they had," he said when asked about his motivation. "It wasn't jealousy, I don't think it was that. It was just control. The power of it." His words dripped with an eerie detachment, as though he wasn't confessing to lives stolen, but recounting mundane chores completed on a weekend. Perhaps the most chilling part of his confession came when he was asked if there were others, victims who hadn't yet been identified. William responded with a small, twisted smile and 3 haunting words. "You'll never know." His arrest brought relief to the people of Avon, but it couldn't undo the damage. The sight of his face, now plastered across every news station in America, was a grim reminder of how far evil can reach when left unchecked. For nearly 15 years, a quiet man with a toolbox and a kind word for his neighbors had outwitted suspicion, killed without hesitation, and nearly vanished without a trace. His confession gave answers, but it didn't bring peace. Instead, it left behind a legacy of anguish, a community forever scarred by what had lurked in its midst for so long. Motive for the crimes, envy, and the desire for power. Long after William Cooper's capture, the question remained, why? Why would a man who seemed to live an unassuming quiet life, a man who attended town meetings, fixed his neighbors' gutters and waved at children riding bicycles, commit such atrocious and calculated acts of violence? For years, it was the question that haunted Avon and those who had crossed paths with him. It wasn't enough to know what he had done, people needed to understand why. During his chilling confessions to law enforcement, William revealed glimpses of his psyche, though his answers were vague, almost dismissive. He didn't talk about rage or hatred in the way many killers might. Instead, his words were laced with something colder, deeper, and more insidious: envy and an insatiable hunger for control. These were the forces that drove him, guiding his decisions and turning his small-town existence into a web of manipulation and horror. "I wasn't mad at them," he explained when asked about his victims. "It's not like I hated them, I just saw something in them that they didn't deserve, and I couldn't let them keep it." This bizarre fragment of insight left investigators grappling with what he meant. Over time they pieced together a clearer picture of William's motives, rooted in jealousy, entitlement, and a twisted view of relationships. His crimes weren't the reckless acts of a man in the grip of uncontrollable anger. They were deliberate, orchestrated displays of dominance born from feelings of inferiority and resentment. A deep-seated jealousy. On the surface, William Cooper was the picture of an ordinary man, but as the details of his life emerged, a different story began to take shape. William had always been an outsider, not because he was rejected by society, but because he carried an internal bitterness that distanced him from everyone around him. Though he smiled politely and exchanged pleasantries, William was quietly seething, resentful of the people who seemed to embody lives he believed he couldn't have. The jealousy was never overt. He didn't lash out or complain openly. Instead, it simmered beneath his unassuming exterior, slowly festering until it warped his worldview. To William, his victims were not just individuals, they were symbols, representations of traits, opportunities, or connections he felt had been unfairly withheld from him. He saw their happiness, their ambition, their freedom, and became consumed by the idea that they didn't deserve them. Take Sarah Thompson, for example. Sarah, with her sunny demeanor and bright smile, was devoted to her students and her garden. To the town she was an altruistic figure, a person who brought warmth and light. To William, though, she embodied something else. "She acted like the world owed her something," he once said, showing a venom that none of her co-workers or neighbors ever saw. In Sarah, he saw someone who had friends, purpose, and a future he felt was denied to him. "She couldn't even see how lucky she was," he muttered in his confession. "She took it all for granted." Marlene Diaz, the peddler, was another target of his envy. Marlene was a free spirit, moving where the wind blew her. Her laughter echoed down Avon streets as she sold her handmade soaps and freshly baked bread. To most, she was a harmless eccentric, but to William, she represented the kind of independence he could never grasp, a life lived on her terms, without constraint. When he saw her cart weaving through neighborhoods, he saw freedom, and it enraged him. She thought she was better than everyone, he claimed, drifting around like she didn't have to answer to anyone. William's jealousy infected every interaction he had with his victims. Whether it was Sarah's kindness, Marlene's independence, or Michelle Carter's fresh start after moving to Avon, William focused on their lives the way a starving man might fixate on a feast. Their happiness was an affront, a personal insult to the bitterness he carried. But it wasn't just envy that motivated him. There was something even darker festering beneath the surface, a lust for power, the thrill of control. For William, jealousy was only the spark. The true fire came from the sense of power he felt when he took everything away from those he envied. His actions weren't about impulse or fleeting anger. They were about control, about seizing the upper hand and holding it with brutal authority. It wasn't enough for him to despise someone from afar. He needed to bend them to his will, to prove, to himself and perhaps to the world, that he could dominate them completely. Investigators believed that William's victims weren't chosen solely based on their isolation or their lack of strong community ties. Those qualities helped him avoid detection, yes, but the key factor was the satisfaction he derived from holding their fate in his hands. His journal entries, later uncovered by police, hinted at his mindset during these moments. Short clinical observations captured his twisted calculations. "Michelle thought she was untouchable," one entry read. "She laughed like nothing could ever hurt her. She didn't even see me coming." For William, these acts weren't just about eliminating people who made him feel inferior, they were about proving something to himself. In taking their lives, he found a warped sense of validation. It was as if each victim's death reinforced the lie he continually told himself, "I am the one in control." His need for power extended beyond the act of murder. William collected trophies, mementos of his victims that he could revisit in private. A bracelet here, a driver's license there. These keepsakes weren't simply souvenirs, they were tokens of his dominance. Each item reminded him of the control he had wielded, of the lives he had extinguished with nobody realizing what was happening. The desire to be remembered. One psychological profile of William suggested another layer to his motives, a desire to be seen. For years William had blended into the background, forgotten by the town even as he fixed roofs and painted fences. His role as a handyman made him invisible, a fixture, not a person. Over time, this invisibility became intolerable to him. The crimes, some experts suggested, may have been his way of refusing to fade into obscurity. He didn't just want to take away what others had, said one criminologist who analyzed William's case. He wanted to leave a mark. As sick as it sounds, his killings were a way for him to assert his existence, to say, "You can't ignore me anymore." Perhaps this is why, even during his confessions, William spoke with a strange veneer of pride. When one detective asked him if he felt remorse, William smirked and shook his head. "What would be the point of that?" he replied. "Remorse doesn't change anything. They trusted me. That was their mistake." And in that chilling, simple sentence, William revealed the core of his psyche. To him, his victims weren't just people, they were pawns in a game of power, symbols of his control, and reminders of his triumph over the trust and kindness that small-town Avon had always prided itself on. The legacy of a twisted soul. Even after years of analysis, William Cooper's motives remained difficult to fully reconcile. Was he driven more by jealousy or by his hunger for control? Did he kill to claim the lives he thought he deserved, or to punish those who succeeded where he felt he had failed? In truth, it was likely a poisonous combination of both, envy simmering into resentment, resentment morphing into dominance. What Avon learned from William's crimes is that monsters aren't always easy to spot. Sometimes they're the quiet man mowing his lawn on Sunday afternoon, or the handyman fixing your porch. His actions were born of dark desires, but his ability to hide them, to bury them beneath layers of trust and familiarity, was what made him so dangerous. The trial that shook the nation. By the time William Cooper finally stood trial in Indiana, the name that once meant nothing outside of Avon had become a symbol of unimaginable terror. For over a year, the public had been fixated on every shred of information about the case. By the time the trial began, the media frenzy surrounding Cooper had turned into a national event. Reporters descended upon the courthouse in droves, their vans and cameras lining the streets as though the eyes of the entire country were turned on the proceedings. For the small-town residents of Avon, many of whom made the 3-hour drive to be present, it was an eerie and surreal experience. Their quiet, unassuming handyman now sat in a federal courtroom, shackled at both wrists and under heavy security. His face, once a familiar presence at block parties and hardware store aisles, was now infamous, casting a shadow over every corner of their once idyllic lives. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it became a reflection of a community's collective guilt, a nation's fascination with the psychology of evil, and the quest for justice for victims who had vanished without answers for so long. It was not just about what William Cooper had done, it was about confronting how he had done it in plain sight, and why so many had failed to see it. Courtroom drama begins on a gray morning in November 2005. Crowds packed the courthouse. Dozens of protesters waved signs with phrases like, "Justice for Avon's lost angels," and "Cooper deserves no mercy." Family members of Sarah Thompson, Marlene Diaz, Michelle Carter, and other victims filed quietly into the courtroom, some clutching tissues, others the hands of loved ones for strength. They sat on one side of the gallery, visibly steeling themselves to listen to the horrors that would unfold over the coming weeks. The opposing side of the room remained sparse, save for occasional reporters and William's public defenders. William Cooper himself entered with the calm, mechanical demeanor that had become his hallmark. He scarcely glanced at the gallery, his face remained blank, betraying no emotion as the charges against him were read aloud, multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, obstruction, and evidence tampering. For each name, Sarah, Marlene, James, Michelle, and others, the judge's steady voice seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of lives lost. The prosecution opened with a blistering summation, painting Cooper as a cold-blooded predator who exploited the trust of his small, tight-knit community for years. "This case is not about mistakes or misunderstandings," the lead prosecutor said, pacing the room. "This case is about calculated evil. It's about a man who preyed upon his neighbors, all while mowing his lawn and waving hello like everyone else. That's what makes this man so dangerous. He doesn't just kill, he deceives." When the prosecutor gestured toward Cooper and called him a quiet devil in sheep's clothing, the gallery held its breath. Cooper simply stared straight ahead, unaffected, as though he were a stranger in the room. Evidence that painted a monster. The heart of the prosecution's case rested on the chilling evidence recovered from Cooper's backyard, home, and journals. Over the first 2 weeks of the trial, Dozens of forensic experts, detectives, and witnesses were called to the stand to piece together a harrowing timeline of events. Projectors displayed images of bones unearthed from his yard, items of clothing that once belonged to the victims, and the haunting jars of hair and personal belongings found hidden throughout Cooper's house. It was the journals, however, that left the courtroom in stunned silence. An FBI analyst read excerpts aloud, each entry growing more sinister than the last. One wrote of Sarah Thompson, "She's alone again today. Easy target. She'll welcome me in." Another noted Michelle Carter's schedule in eerie detail. 8:15 out of the apartment, same smile every morning, too trusting for her own good. The journals not only proved premeditation but illuminated a window into the twisted mind of someone who saw his victims as objects to manipulate, subjects in a grotesque game of power. As each word was recited, gasps and muffled sobs filled the courtroom. For the family members in attendance, it was not only evidence, it was their loved ones' last moments brought to horrifying life. The prosecution also relied on emotional testimonies from the families. Sarah's mother, her voice trembling, recounted the day her daughter vanished, and the years of sleepless nights that followed. Michelle's best friend choked up explaining how she had once received a voicemail from Michelle the week of her disappearance, a voicemail that became a ghostly reminder of the last time she ever heard her friend's voice. Marlene's cousin recounted finding her cart abandoned near Cooper's property, a suspicion she regretted never following up on. The defense's weak response. The defense, tasked with the hopeless job of representing a man everyone already believed was guilty, tread lightly. They leaned on William's supposed mental illness, trying to cast his actions as the product of a troubled mind rather than calculated evil. "This is not to absolve him," one of his lawyers stated solemnly. "This is to explain him." The problem for the defense was that William never seemed to cooperate with this narrative. When psychologists were called to assess him, they found him lucid and disturbingly aware of his actions. "He knew what he was doing," said one forensic psychiatrist. "There's no ambiguity about that. He didn't hear voices, he didn't feel compelled by an outside force. He did this because he wanted to." The chilling detachment in William's interviews, punctuated by sentences like, "It was their fault for trusting me," worked to undermine any claim of insanity. Perhaps the defense's most desperate attempt was calling William to the stand in his own defense. It was a bold, highly criticized move, and when William finally took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward in tense anticipation. Yet, his testimony offered little in the way of redemption or remorse. Speaking in a monotone, he described his actions with a clinical simplicity that unsettled even his own legal team. "I didn't go hunting them," he said flatly. "They trusted me. I just knew they wouldn't see it coming. And I liked that. Liked the control." Those chilling words seemed to seal his fate. A nation watches justice delivered after weeks of testimony and evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The outcome felt inevitable. On a crisp Friday afternoon, the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. As he announced the sentence, death by lethal injection, the gallery erupted in a mix of grief and relief. Victims' families embraced one another, wiping away both tears of sorrow and bittersweet justice. For them, the trial had brought answers but not closure. "Nothing brings our Sarah back," Sarah Thompson's mother told reporters outside the courthouse. "But today, I know he can't hurt anyone else, and maybe, just maybe, my Sarah can rest." The trial of William Cooper wasn't just about convicting a killer. It was a moment of reckoning for Avon, a reckoning for small-town trust and the illusion of safety. Over the following weeks, reporters and psychologists dissected the case endlessly, proposing theories about how Cooper could remain undetected for years. Documentaries, books, and podcasts followed. Cooper became a name synonymous with deception and manipulation, a reminder that evil doesn't always come wrapped in shadow, it sometimes smiles at you from across the street. The haunting legacy of the trial. Years later, the trial remains as infamous as the crimes themselves. For Avon, it was not only the moment they confronted William Cooper, but also the moment they confronted their own failures as a community. The courtroom may have been where justice was officially delivered, but the scars left behind, the mistrust, the guilt, the lingering whispers of "how did we not see this sooner," would linger for decades. The end of a crime spree. William Cooper's execution in 2006 marked the official end of one of the most disturbing crime sprees in modern small-town America. For Avon, it was supposed to be the conclusion of a nightmare, the closing of a grim chapter that had haunted its streets and hearts for nearly a decade. And yet, the shadow William cast over the town stretched long after his death, lingering in ways no one could have fully anticipated. The execution itself, carried out by lethal injection at an Indiana state penitentiary, was a cold, clinical procedure compared to the horrors Cooper inflicted upon his victims. Family members of Sarah Thompson, Michelle Carter, Marlene Diaz, James Harper, and the other lives he had stolen were given the opportunity to witness the event, though not all accepted. Sarah's mother sat quietly in the front row of the viewing chamber, her hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. At no point did she cry. Years of grief, anger, and guilt had etched permanent lines into her face, but she had made it clear she didn't come for closure. "There's no such thing as closure," she told reporters beforehand. "I just came to make sure that when I walk out of here, he stays behind." For others in the room, the emotions were less restrained. Michelle Carter's father turned halfway through the procedure, unable to watch William take his last breath. Her younger sister, who had placed a single photograph of Michelle in a locket she wore that day, stared unflinchingly at the glass. "He looked so normal in the end," she said later, "like he wasn't even sorry." In his final moments, William refused to offer any real explanation for his actions or words of remorse. When asked if he had anything to say before the execution began, he simply shook his head and muttered, "It doesn't matter anymore." It was an anticlimactic end for a man whose crimes had shattered lives and rippled across the fabric of a nation, sparking fear, anger, and endless questions. William Cooper would leave no poetic justification, no final confession, only the dark, hollow silence he had carried with him throughout his trial and incarceration. And so, with the slow injection of lethal substances into his veins, William Cooper was pronounced dead. There were no cheers from onlookers, no celebrations. Executions, as some attending remarked, rarely brought the kind of justice people hoped for. They were an end, yes, but certainly not an equalizer. "Just because he's gone doesn't mean it's over," Sarah's mother later said. And she was right. In many ways, the true fight for Avon began after William's death. The town left behind. Back in Avon, news of William's execution traveled quickly. The same streets that had once rung with children's laughter and neighborly chatter now felt quieter, more subdued. Beyond the initial media circus that William's crimes brought to the town, there was something darker. A permanent fissure in the town's identity. Avon had always been the kind of place where neighbors waved to one another, where people left their doors unlocked, where trust was taken for granted. That idyllic picture had been shattered, and it couldn't be taped back together. In the weeks and months following William's death, some residents began referring to their town in terms of before William and after William. The dividing line was stark. Before William, Avon was thought of as a sanctuary, a pocket of safety away from the chaos of the larger cities that surrounded it. After William, it was no longer immune to fear, paranoia, and suspicion. "We thought we knew each other," one longtime Avon resident said during an interview. "We told ourselves we were a family, but William, he exposed something we weren't ready to see. We were blind, too trusting." Neighborhoods grew distant in the months that followed. People who once casually knocked on neighbors' doors to share a cup of sugar now hesitated. Curtains stayed drawn more often. Locking doors became second nature, not an afterthought. Avon's residents weren't just afraid of another William Cooper, they were afraid of each other. It was a sinister legacy left behind by a man who had thrived in the shadows of trust and familiarity. Shrines and demons. A small memorial was erected near the center of town, honoring the lives of William's known victims. Their names were engraved on a sleek granite slab, surrounded by a bed of marigolds carefully tended by volunteers. For Sarah's mother, it became a weekly ritual to visit the site, leaving fresh flowers and sometimes a small card scribbled with memories of her daughter. "I'll never stop talking to her," she told a local journalist. "She used to call me every day, even to say nothing at all. This is all I have to fill the silence." But the memorial wasn't just a place of healing, it became a focal point for the town's collective guilt. Every name etched into the stone symbolized someone Avon had failed to protect. Town meetings found themselves dominated by somber discussions about what had gone wrong. How could they have ignored the signs? How had a man like William been able to operate for so long without raising suspicion? For a town that prided itself on unity, these revelations were difficult to stomach. Marlene Diaz's niece, who had grown up hearing stories of her aunt's cheerful peddling cart and infectious laugh, voiced anger louder than others. At one meeting she declared, "My aunt lived on the edges of your town, but she wasn't invisible. You let her disappear because it was easier than asking questions. Well, I have one for you. If she'd been anyone else, someone who fit your perfect mold, would you have fought harder to find her?" Her words stung, bouncing off the quiet walls of a community hall packed with faces that couldn't meet her eyes. Avon was grieving not just for the lives stolen but for its own blindness, a lingering fear. Even with the perpetrator caught, convicted, and executed, the fear never truly left Avon. Stories of William Cooper became folklore, passed down to younger generations as cautionary tales, but they didn't need embellishment to be haunting. For years, reminders of his crimes persisted in small, unsettling ways. The overgrown yard of Cooper's old house remained untouched for nearly a decade, no one willing to buy the property despite repeated reductions in price. "Who would want to live there?" people whispered. "Who could?" Children who once rode bikes freely now stayed closer to their homes, their parents watching intently with wary eyes from porches and windows. Conversations often circled back to those infamous years. "Do you remember that Sunday when William smiled at us from across the street with that hedge trimmer?" one resident might ask, their voice uneasy. "How long do you think he'd already been killing by then?" For some, the paranoia dulled over time, replaced by routines and a quieter kind of vigilance. But for others, the pain was forever fresh. The scars William left weren't just on the families of his victims, but on every neighbor who felt they should have seen through his mask. A lesson too late. The ultimate lesson of Avon wasn't lost on the town or the nation that had followed its story so closely. In the years after William's execution, Avon underwent countless reforms. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up, support networks for newcomers, the lonely and the isolated were strengthened. Law enforcement, once understaffed and overwhelmed, received funding for more officers and specialized training. There was a collective determination that no one would slip through the cracks again, not like William did, but none of those changes erased what had happened. None of them eased the question that burned brightest in the hearts of Avon's residents. Could we have stopped him sooner? "I think about that every day," Sarah's mother admitted years later, "and the only answer I can come up with is yes. We could have stopped him, we just weren't looking." Years removed from that terrible time, people still visit Avon to see the memorial, to walk the streets that once seemed idyllic but now feel haunted by the weight of tragedy. For the town itself, William Cooper's death marked the end of his crimes, but his legacy, and the lessons it brought, will likely never fade. The costly lessons from the case. The story of William Cooper wasn't just a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers lurking in small-town America. It became a stark reminder of human vulnerability, complacency, and the terrifying consequences of misplaced trust. Avon's ordeal uncovered more than the darkness hiding behind white picket fences. It exposed the cracks in the very foundation of a community's belief in itself. The lessons learned from the tragedy would echo long after the final headlines faded, challenging not only Avon but communities everywhere to rethink what safety means, and how fragile it truly is. The fragility of trust. The most glaring lesson Avon had to confront was how devastatingly fragile trust can be. Small towns are built on the premise of knowing one another. It's the unwritten promise of neighborliness, of shared values, of seeing the same familiar faces year after year. "This is a place where you trust your babysitters, your dog walkers, the guy who fixes your roof," one lifelong Avon resident said, reflecting on the crimes. And then William comes along and shows us we never really knew him, or each other. Trust was Cooper's greatest weapon. He exploited it with chilling precision, offering to help neighbors with small repairs, attending community events just often enough to blend in, and smiling politely at passing strangers. His victims invited him into their homes without hesitation because he looked and acted like everyone else. Through that trust he carefully crafted, he wove his camouflage so well that no one thought to look deeper. The revelation of Cooper's crimes shattered that sense of unguarded trust Avon had prided itself on. Parents stopped letting their children play on front lawns. Neighbors stopped leaving spare keys with friends. Simple, casual waves from across the street started to feel loaded with suspicion. Avon learned the hard way that evil doesn't come dressed in black. It wears khakis and drives a beat-up truck. It knows your first name and offers to lend you tools. It thrives in the spaces where trust is given freely, unchecked. "Trust is what made this town feel safe," a retired pastor remarked at a town meeting after the execution. "And William poisoned it. It'll take a generation, maybe more, to get it back." The blind eye of complacency. Avon also became a harsh example of how communities can blind themselves to danger when it's too uncomfortable to confront. Time and time again, signs of Cooper's crimes had surfaced: strange smells, missing women, odd midnight activities in his backyard. but no one connected the dots, and no one wanted to. "This is Avon," people told themselves over and over, almost like an incantation. "Nothing bad ever happens here." That refusal to consider the unthinkable allowed Cooper to operate in plain sight. His crimes weren't hidden. There was nothing supernatural about how he buried bodies in his yard and erased people from their lives. The signs were there, but complacency provided him with all the camouflage he needed. Suspicious behaviors were chalked up to quirks. Disappearances were dismissed as runaway cases or accidents. Even when semblances of a pattern began to emerge, Avon collectively shrugged. It was easier to pretend nothing was wrong, one local historian later mused, because if something was wrong, then what does that say about us? About everything we believed this town represented? This hard lesson sparked debates throughout the country. Critics asked whether small-town idealism was a double-edged sword, giving residents a false sense of security. Could a cultural tendency to mind one's own business and avoid hard truths actually enable predators like Cooper? "Complacency kills," one criminologist bluntly stated during a televised segment about the case. "If Avon teaches us anything, it's that we should notice. If you see something, say something, even, and especially, when you think it's nothing." The consequences of isolation. Another lesson from the case was the devastating impact of isolation, both in a personal and communal sense. Cooper preyed on individuals who were isolated in one way or another. Sarah Thompson, the teacher who lived alone and kept to herself. Michelle Carter, a newcomer to town without strong roots or connections. Marlene Diaz, the itinerant peddler whose transient lifestyle made her an easy target. Isolation didn't just make them vulnerable to Cooper, it made their disappearances easier for Avon to dismiss. Without large extended families nearby or an ingrained social network, these women fell through the cracks. Avon was forced to reckon with this uncomfortable truth. Their town, like so many others in America, wasn't as connected as it claimed to be. If Avon had looked a little harder, reached out to its most vulnerable residents, maybe those lives could have been spared. In the years following the case, Avon shifted its focus. Churches, clubs, and civic organizations began programs to welcome and integrate outsiders who moved into the area. Social networks strengthened as residents committed to looking out for one another again, but this time, with an emphasis on actively including everyone, not just the most familiar faces. "We let fear and discomfort isolate us," said a community organizer. "We can't afford to make the same mistake twice, not when people's lives are on the line." Flaws in the system. Avon wasn't the only entity to take blame. The investigation process, or lack thereof, put local law enforcement under scrutiny. Missing persons cases in the town were mismanaged or deprioritized due to a combination of inexperience, bureaucracy, and a lack of resources. Each disappearance was treated as unrelated, as though it were a fluke of circumstance rather than pieces of a larger puzzle. "We didn't know what we were looking at," one retired Avon officer admitted in a rare interview years later, "and that's on us. We didn't have the right training or the manpower, but to be honest, we also didn't have the mindset. We made the mistake of thinking, this is Avon. This stuff doesn't happen here." But it did. The national attention placed on Avon after Cooper's capture led to widespread calls for reform. Police departments across the country implemented stronger tools for tracking missing persons cases, emphasizing pattern recognition and information sharing between small law enforcement divisions. State and federal resources became more accessible for small towns like Avon to lean on, when crimes exceeded their capacity to manage. A new kind of vigilance. Perhaps the most harrowing lesson was that vigilance isn't just about watching strangers, it's about watching friends, neighbors, and even yourself. William Cooper's crimes forced Avon to confront an unsettling idea. Predators do not always wear masks of cruelty. Sometimes they are the people who show up to help build your fence, bake cookies for your kid's fundraiser, or fix a leaky pipe. Evil does not always announce itself. It infiltrates through familiarity, through comfort, through trust that has gone untested. In the years since Cooper's execution, Avon learned how to balance trust with vigilance, a kind of guarded kindness that didn't come naturally to this once naive town. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up. Residents became more vocal about reporting oddities no matter how small. People learned to reach out, to ask uncomfortable questions, to err on the side of caution. "We don't look away anymore," Sarah's mother told a local reporter years later. "If someone asks for help, we pay attention. If something feels off, we act on it. It shouldn't have taken what happened to my daughter to teach us that. But it did." A legacy written in stone. The story of William Cooper left Avon scarred but wiser. Those scars wouldn't fade, nor should they. The names of Cooper's victims, etched in stone on the town's memorial, served as a permanent reminder of what was lost and what must never be lost again. For other communities watching Avon's painful reckoning from afar, the case became a rallying cry for vigilance, kindness, and accountability. "We saw what happened there," one city council member from a nearby town said, "and we said to ourselves, let's make sure it doesn't happen here." The cost of the lessons Avon endured was immeasurable, paid in human lives, broken trust, and unspoken regrets. But the lessons themselves were clear. Trust, but verify. Notice what you wish to ignore. Stay connected, even when it's hard.